Hey, it's Jared with Gear and Light. Today we're going to compare the Sony a7 IV and the Canon R6. Now, some backstory. I'm shooting with a Canon these last couple of weeks because I led a seminar at a high school for kids on how to shoot video. And I wanted them to have an experience with both Sony and Canon because they're different platforms, they're both great, and I think it's great to have experience with different cameras. Even though I'm primarily a Sony shooter, I still think that there's benefit to shooting with different cameras. And if you've been following this channel for any length of time, you know that I've jumped between some Nikon stuff. I used to shoot Canon back in the day when I first got started, and I've been shooting Sony for the last while. I guess, I don't know, it's been since the a7S came out. So, you know, both cameras are fantastic, and we're going to talk about some things here, some benefits and some features that each camera has that maybe the other one doesn't. But what it really comes down to is understanding your gear and how to shoot. I know a lot of people on YouTube talk about this. It's not so much the gear as it is understanding how to use the gear. So I have courses that are available to teach you how to get the most out of these cameras, the a7 IV or the R6. And so I highly recommend, if you are considering getting one of these cameras or just purchased one of these cameras and you want to understand it fully, all the features, how to shoot in manual mode, and get the most out of these cameras, it's a small investment for getting yourself a jump start on knowing how to use these cameras and also being a better photographer or videographer. Just out of the gate, it helps and will save a lot of time. So what's the same with these cameras? Well, both are mirrorless full frame cameras. Both of them have 5-axis internal stabilization on the sensor, so IBIS. Both of them have that stabilization, which is fantastic, and it works great on both cameras. They both have flip out screens that allow for articulation all the way around so that you can see from the front and the back of the camera easily. And they both have mechanical and electronic shutters. As you can see by looking at their mode dials, they both have pretty much all the same shooting modes as well. And they both have dual SD card slots, which allows for redundancy and expandable storage, so dual SD card slots on both cameras. They also shoot 422 10-bit at 4K 60 frames per second. Each camera both does that, and also shoots HD 120p. Currently, at the time of recording this, both cameras also are $2,500 here in the US. Of course, sometimes they go on sale and become a little bit cheaper for a period of time, but right now they're both the same price. So what's different between these cameras? Well, one major one is the fact that the a7 IV produces higher resolution images at 33 megapixels, where the R6 is 20 megapixel. Of course, the R6 is a little bit older of a camera, and around the time the R6 came out, 20 megapixels was around what we would expect out of that price point for a camera. The R6 has faster continuous shooting, so if you put it in continuous mode to shoot things like sports or fast-moving objects, the Canon will shoot much faster at 12 frames per second with the mechanical shutter, where the Sony will only shoot 10 frames per second. But then if you switch the Canon to electronic shutter, it goes up to 20 frames per second. The R6 is also advertised as allowing for up to 1,000 raw images continuously recording if you have SD cards that are fast enough. An important one for me is the record limit on the Sony. There is none, where the R6 has a 30-minute record limit, which is a little frustrating. Every time that you record to that 30-minute mark, it is going to stop and you will have to start recording again. As far as displays on these cameras, the R6 has a little bit higher of a resolution display, which I really wasn't able to notice much of a difference unless I really zoomed in on an image in playback and started pixel peeping, that I could actually see any difference in the back display, but I really had to be looking for it. The a7 IV has dual SD card slots, just as the R6, but the a7 IV also accepts one CFast Express Type A card, which has extremely faster read and write speeds than even V90 SD cards. So while I don't think that that's necessarily needed for the a7 IV, it does future-proof your camera a little bit, I guess, in the sense that maybe this Type A CFast Express is the future, and if it is, your a7 IV already accepts one. The The R6 has increased focus sensitivity in low light, both in its spec sheet and in my tests in real world. So that low light sensitivity was a reason that I switched from Canon to Sony back in the day, because Sony had Canon beat, and now Canon has stepped back in and really increased their game in that low light focusing performance. The Sony EVF has a 120 Hz refresh rate, which is really nice when you're looking through the eyepiece on the camera. That 120 Hz refresh rate means that things are just really sharp and snappy and moving quickly, which is important when you're shooting fast-moving subjects. Now, the Canon R6 only has phase detect autofocus, where Sony is still utilizing that hybrid contrast detection and phase detection autofocus that made them real popular, and people were switching from Canon over to Sony. However, as I said before, and I'll talk about a little bit later, the Canon has a lot more phase detect autofocus points. It does not have contrast, but it doesn't seem to hurt the Canon R6 much at all. While in photo or video recording modes, the A7 IV shows a lot more valuable information on the back display, whereas the Canon does not, such as how much time you have left recording on an SD card when you're filming video. One feature severely lacking in the Sony is the ability for the information that is on your EVF when you're looking through, such as your settings and your metering. They rotate on the Canon. So when I'm looking through and shooting a landscape orientation photo, all of the information is down at the bottom or perhaps at the top. And if I rotate the camera, information stays at the bottom or at the top. It isn't sideways like it is on the Sony. Sony still hasn't updated that after all these years. Very thankful that Canon did that. So let's talk about my experiences with the Canon R6. I've been shooting with this camera a lot over the last couple of weeks because it really is reminiscent to me of my days of shooting with the 5D Mark III, and I loved those DSLR cameras back then. I did not want to switch to Sony, but I needed performance, and Sony had performance at the time. Canon has really stepped things up and seemed to really be coming into their own with their mirrorless lineup and understanding what people want. The R6 is very much a 5D Mark IV, but mirrorless. I mean, everything feels the same and looks the same. Of course, there's features and things that are different. It is more modernized, but it gives me that same experience that I was used to when shooting DSLR. And so I think it is a natural upgrade for people to move from DSLR Canon cameras to something like the R6 or maybe even the R5. So my experiences with this camera have just been absolutely fantastic. Ever since the mirrorless platform launched and Canon launched their RF lenses, I've continued to be impressed with their lenses. The build quality, how they look and feel with the camera itself, and the performance is just amazing. Canon is thinking forward with their lenses, and this control ring that they've added to lenses to give additional functionality to lenses, because they're an electronic lens, so why not put some features on the lens, is very smart and really makes me think that Canon is thinking future forward. What can we do that's outside of the box? What features and performance can we give to our photographers and video creators? The low light focusing performance on this camera blew me away. Like I said before, that is why I left Canon and went to Sony. I needed low light performance when I was shooting weddings, when I was shooting events in lower light situations, and my Canon 5D Mark III, and even when I used the 5D Mark IV, could not even find subjects that I could clearly see with my eyes. I needed to switch, and that's what took me over to Sony and has kept me at Sony all of this time. So low light focusing performance is great on this camera, and I'm super impressed by it. The focus does seem a little bit jumpy, so not just in low light situations, but in regular situations, the focus seems jumpy, like it's always worried about finding somebody else. I feel like the camera has a little bit of focus anxiety, like what's going on around me? Do I need to be focusing on that? What do they want me to do? Thankfully, the focus tracking is really good on this camera, so if you do tap on a subject, it stays locked on and tracks that subject. But that's a lot of stuff to be thinking about as a photographer or a video creator utilizing autofocus. You really have to work that into your muscle memory, that I'm going to need to tap and track this subject so that the camera doesn't go crazy. Because of that, I still end up using single point autofocus to keep the camera from jumping around. The ergonomics of the R6 is just absolutely fantastic. It's better for the size of my hand, this camera's ergonomics. It just fits in my hand better than any of the Sonys that I've had. Of course, the Sonys over the last multiple years have been getting a little beefier as well because they were so small and hard to hold on to. And so the R6, as I said, feels very much like a 5D and reminiscent of that, which I liked. I liked having a little bit more camera to hold on to. Just because it's a little bit bigger of a camera doesn't mean that it's significantly heavier. If I'm holding both of these cameras in each hand, I can't feel a difference in weight between them. So I do know that the Sony is a little bit lighter because I weighed it, but the Canon R6 is not even noticeably different unless I had weighed it and saw the difference in a number. The familiar menu system and button layout on this Canon it's impressive that Canon has stuck so long with this menu system. I think Canon has always had a decent menu system. I don't think it's the best menu system out there, but I do think it's decent. And if you are familiar with Canon and have been using Canon for a long time, or even been using Canon at all, this is going to be a very familiar menu system to you, especially if you're coming from DSLR. That can also be said for the button layout as well. Now, when Canon came out with the EOS R, they threw everything out and thought about redesigning, and really I think that hurt them. And the EOS R was not a winner because it was too much of a departure from Canon's typical infrastructure and layout of their cameras. And so going back to what works with the R6, I think was a wise choice, and buttons are really well laid out. The only button that I find a little awkward is this lock button, but it does just lock your settings controls. You can still do things like hit your record button and stuff like that, but at times if you forget that your controls are locked, then you're trying to make adjustments and you might miss an opportunity. I think it would have been better for them to move this lock button elsewhere. When recording video, I did have issues with the R6 unless I was using really fast SD cards. Now these days, I think you do need to use V series SD cards, whether they're V30, V60, or V90. I did have to put V90 SD cards when recording 4K video, even at just 24p in the R6. Otherwise, I would run into issues with the camera stopping recording. I have a lot of SD cards that are very fast SD cards, but not V-rated SD cards, and they work just fine in my Sony unless I'm recording something like 4K 60 or on one of my other cameras that will do 4K 120. They're fine, but on the R6 I found that they were not reliable. So I do highly recommend using V90 SD cards on your R6 if you're going to be recording 4K. So now let's talk about my experiences with the A7 IV. Now I have more video content on the A7 IV because I've had this camera for a few months now, so I'm not going to go super into detail here, but I am going to talk about a few things that stick out to me with the A7 IV. First of all, Sony just continues to improve on their cameras. The A7 IV is fantastic. It's faster in every way. Autofocus is better. Of course, the increased resolution is great, and overall, it's just a fantastic camera. They've improved the focus speed and accuracy on the A7 IV as well. I mentioned before that the R6 seems a little jumpy. The Sony doesn't seem as jumpy when trying to figure out what it should be focusing on. It does lock onto the subjects really well, and tracking works really well on the Sony. So I do still use single point autofocus though, because all of these cameras do tend to search around a bit, and I want the camera to be much faster and snappier at landing on the intended subject. The information displayed on the back of the Sony is just super useful, having my record times left for both SD cards, knowing which recording format that I'm in, and just having a lot of other information on display. It does seem like maybe a little bit disorganized. There's a lot of information there on the back of the display, but on the Canon, it just lacks information altogether. I have to stop recording to see the information that's most important to me. In my tests, which are not scientific tests, the Sony has had slightly better battery life. In my recording tests, where I let both cameras record to 30 minutes because the R6 would stop at 30 minutes, and also just shooting photos, shooting video, I've had more battery left on the Sony than I have with the Canon over a period of time. Not so much of a difference that it's huge, like that the Sony kicked the R6's butt, but definitely there's always been just a little bit more battery life on the A7 IV, enough that's noticeable for me to mention it. So which camera should you choose? Again, before I dive into this section, I want you to remember that it's not so much about the gear as it is your understanding of the gear. Both of these cameras are fantastic, and if I was starting from the beginning, it would be really hard for me to decide which camera to go to. I would be watching this video. So if you're in that place where you do need to learn more about cameras and photography and video, I highly recommend my courses that I spoke of earlier. They're going to walk you through everything that you need to know about this specific camera that you choose, also how to shoot in the different shooting modes, giving you lots of tips for settings and adjustments that you can make to the camera so that you can hit the streets and get the shots that you want right out of the gate. So my first question to you would be, if you already have lenses for either one of these platforms or lenses that adapt really well to either one of these platforms, that might help you make the decision. If you used to shoot on Canon and have a few Canon lenses, even if they're EF lenses that can be easily mounted to the RF lens mount, that might help make your decision. Of course, you can use some of those older Canon lenses on your Sony as well using adapters, and from what I've seen online, it seems like performance is pretty much equal depending on what adapter that you get for your cameras. But if you're starting with no lenses that would fit on either of these, or you're getting into photography or moving up from a point and shoot style camera or even your smartphone, it's really just going to come down to ergonomics and features. And we'll talk a little bit more about that here as we close out this video. So Sony currently has more lens options. That's one thing to consider, because Sony mirrorless with their FE and even their E mount has been around longer. And so not only are there more Sony brand lenses, but there are more aftermarket lenses as well. And that's not to say that anybody's been asleep over with Canon. Canon has been putting out a lot of fantastic lenses, and aftermarket lenses have been coming out as well. So while Sony is further ahead there, and there are more budget-friendly lenses available for Sony than there are for Canon right now with their RF lens platform, Canon is catching up. They are releasing lenses. Third-party manufacturers are releasing lenses all the time, so it's becoming less and less of an issue, but right now there definitely is a lot more options for the Sony E-mount platform. If you're choosing one of these cameras for photography primarily, 33 megapixels versus 20, I like having the additional resolution. It's extremely useful for cropping in on subjects that I couldn't get close enough to. I would choose the Sony hands down over that because of the resolution increase. I did spend a little bit of time looking into different tests that have been run on these cameras, and since the A7 IV is relatively new, there's a lot less information out there than there is for the R6. Now, DxO Mark on the R6 is not super impressive. At the time that this camera was tested by them, it definitely did not live up to the A7 III that was out at the time. The A7 III ranked significantly higher than the R6 as far as image, color, quality, and all of the different areas that they test. The A7 III, which is an older version of the A7 IV, outperformed the R6. So the A7 IV, I would assume, being better and improvements over the A7 III, would stand out even further ahead than the R6. But there are no tests like with DxO Mark that I can compare these two. So this is just speculation and assumptions at this point, but it is something to consider. So let's talk about the conclusion here, which, you can't go wrong with either of these cameras. They're both absolutely fantastic. As I've mentioned many times, Canon has really matured in their mirrorless line with these cameras. I think Canon has finally figured out what people want, and what they want is mirrorless cameras that are like their DSLR line. And I think it's been very smart for Canon to stop trying to do things differently and really just work on improving what they've done so well for so long and making better versions of that, which they definitely did in the R6. I'm excited for the future of Canon RF lenses. I think that as they continue to expand their lens lineup, and even add in more lenses like this 35mm f1.8, which is more budget friendly, a more wider variety of lens options like they have with their EF mount, I'm just excited to see what they come up with and how they improve upon lenses that were already just amazing lenses that have been around even for a long time. But being that both of these cameras are the same price, I do feel like the Sony brings a little bit more value to the table. Now, Sony did increase their price, I think, to match what the R6 is going for, and that's because Sony can do that. The A7 III, which has been out for a while, was cheaper. I mean, right now you can get one for around $1,600, $1,700, and so if these cameras are a little bit outside of your budget, you may even consider getting an A7 III. I think an A7 III is still a good contender against the R6. As I mentioned before, it ranking a little bit better with image quality. However, the R6 is a great competitor to the A7 IV in things like autofocus performance. I think Canon's next version of the R6, whether it be an R6 Mark II or something like that, is just going to really blow us out of the water. So if you're looking for a camera right now, it's really going to come down to the things that I mentioned in this video and what you find important. Choosing a camera is very much a personal choice. I've got links down in the description below for you so that you can purchase these cameras through those affiliate links. There's no cost to you for doing those things. They're just links that help support our channel when you click and make a purchase. So Sony A7 IV versus the R6. What are your thoughts? Let me know down in the comment section below. And if you have any questions, ask them down there and I'll do my best to answer them. But that's going to do it for today. I hope to see you back in another video soon or in one of the courses for these cameras. Thanks for being here and take care.